we switch the camera to show the panel when it's that point?
Right. You hit, you gotta make it out of this full screen. I'll show you real quick. It is preset 2. And unfortunately, my presets got reset, so when you hit preset 2, you can't really go back to the speaker unless you manually do it. So you'll have to, so just preset 2. And you don't even need to switch the screen or anything, you can just hit preset 2. Actually, you will have to go to video conference and then hit preset 2.
Okay.
So video conference, hit preset 2, and that's it.
Okay. And I can hit this to get it over a little bit to include this person here?
Yeah, you can, I would say zoom out. And if,
Okay.
yeah, I would say zoom out. And this window will be open.
Okay.
So you can visually see it. Hey, Keating Lobby 1, can you raise your hand if you can hear me okay? Or is it Lobby 2? Mm-mm.
How would you know?
He should be able to raise his hand for me, but...
On here?
Yeah. Oh well. Just doing a sound check, that's all. Sound check for the lobby. Keating Lobby, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay out there in the Keating Lobby? Yeah, it's a USB. I wonder if it's just that it's too low. All right, Keating Lobby. All right, actually, let me just go out here. Hey, Eddie, Eddie, can you hear me okay? Is it coming through? Okay. Yep, testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. You got to turn it way up. Yeah, you got to jack it up to like 60, or higher for you to really hear it. Can you hear me now? I'm going to turn the mic up in the room a little bit here. Just a moment. How about now? How about now? How about that? Yeah? Okay.
Test, test. Hi. It's great to have you this evening. I think this is our fifth Precision Wellness Initiative Symposia speaker, and it's just been a wonderful series. So thank you for joining us. I know there are several people out, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Am I echoing too bad? Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do. Hold it down here? Okay.
Keep going. You're good.
Okay. Hello. Okay. So I always start these. We've had, as I said, we've had 4 speakers to date, and this has just been an incredible symposia series. I always start each one just to kind of understand what our North Star is, what we're trying to accomplish with this whole symposia series, and I always start it with this pathway. Many of our early speakers really focused on early environmental diversity and how that really gave rise through evolution to a great deal of human diversity, and I know our first 2 speakers focused on that. We then, as we move down, we have this evolutionary discordance. We have very, very rapid changes in our diets and lifestyles that are too recent on an evolutionary timescale for us to adapt. And we see the results of the modern Western diet. Again, we see the interaction of all of this genetic, epigenetic variation among populations and individuals, and we watch it interact with nutritional and lifestyle landscapes of these populations and individuals, and from that we see rather catastrophic events. We can measure many of these changes utilizing new techniques like metabolomics and molecular network analysis. We're in just a wonderful place here at the U of A with our data science and our abundance of data science. So it can make sense of all of this large data and help us integrate these biological systems. So we can get to here, and we think, at least in my laboratory, that this puts us a whole lot closer to clinical and molecular phenotypes than we've been able to achieve before. So tonight we're going to move to a very important step that we haven't covered to date. And it has to be as precision, as Heather reminded me today, as all the others, or none of this works. And as I'm reminded by Mr. Keating, who this building's named over, the first time I showed him this slide, he says, "Don't matter what all that science says if you can't get people to do the right thing." So it doesn't matter what all of this science says if you can't get people to do the right thing. That was my Southern accent. He didn't say it that way. So tonight Heather is joining us, and we're so lucky. Behavioral change models, precision behavior change, the final step to implementation of precision wellness. And I'm going to bring Melanie Hingle up and allow her to introduce her friend, Heather, and thank you.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Good evening or late afternoon. I'm so thrilled to introduce Heather Patrick, who is my longtime colleague and friend in the digital health space, behavior change space, and really excited to have you hear what she has to say tonight. So a little bit about her. She is an internationally renowned expert in human motivation and behavior change and health technology, all those things converging, and has more than 15 years of experience developing interventions in person and via technology, which she'll tell you a little bit about tonight, across behaviors including physical activity, healthy eating, weight management, stress management, and smoking cessation. So all the super important behaviors that impact us. And she's worked across different sectors, including academia, federal funding agencies, and now in the private sector in the area of employee wellness, health insurance, and at startup and established technology companies. So has crossed the whole gamut in her professional world. And she's right now splitting her time between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., if you can imagine that commute. And D.C. is home, but maybe Silicon Valley is going to be that someday. So I'm going to let her do the honors and talk about what she's here to share with you, which is all about the behavioral phenome. So thank you, and help me welcome Dr. Heather Patrick.
All right, good evening. It's great to be here, so thank you to Melanie and colleagues for inviting me. I want to talk to you guys tonight a little bit about kind of where we sit at the intersection of technology and human behavior change, and importantly, how we can leverage human behavior to help us develop more precise interventions so that we're able not only to develop programs from the outset that have a degree of fine-tuned tailoring, but also potentially through the proliferation of technology, also have the capacity to adapt those interventions perhaps in real time as the technology becomes increasingly sophisticated. This seems not to be working. It's on now. That, I think, will help. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the genome, because I know that's, first of all, an issue that's near and dear to the hearts and minds of many here in this room. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the promise of precision medicine. And that was really the thrust behind mapping the human genome, this idea that we would be able to, through mapping the genome, develop improved approaches for preventing, diagnosing, and treating a range of conditions, and certainly we've started to see that today around things like targeted cancer therapies, where we're able to understand not only is this a person who might do well with this because they're diagnosed with Cancer X, but looking at the genetic markers within the tumors themselves to develop targeted treatments that not only target the cancer, but also result in much lower side effects and improved both quality and length of life for patients. The promise of precision medicine is also around helping us to develop a better understanding of some of the underlying mechanisms by which various conditions occur. So understanding who might be at risk for particular conditions and how we might use that information to engage prevention farther upstream before people even develop conditions. And finally, this opportunity to have an improved ability to predict which treatments will work best for which patients. And all of that is amazing, and we are living in such a fantastic time in terms of medical technology and medical treatments, understanding not only what to do when people get conditions, but how to know who might get them. But I think it's important to take a step back here and look at what are the major determinants of health. And while genetics is certainly a large part of that, behavioral patterns make up the lion's share of what causes most of the conditions that people will live with and live through. So behavioral patterns like what people eat, how physically active they are, exposure to nicotine and tobacco, alcohol use, sleep, stress management. All of those behaviors are implicated in a host of conditions, including cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And so while it's really important for us to take in mind that genetics and behavior often interact, we have to make sure that all of the time that we're spending looking at some of the biological processes, that we're also looking at the behavioral processes. So technology has given us this opportunity to think a lot about big data. And one of the things that I've noticed when we talk about big data is that we're still thinking about data as it exists in the context of the healthcare system. And the healthcare system in the United States is largely about treating people when they are sick. It is not about working with people prior to developing conditions. And so you'll see here that kind of we've got this suite of sources of data, and only one of them, is this the pointer? It's not. And only one of them, mobile data and wearables, is something that consumers are directly contributing to or feeding into the system. So I'm going to suggest tonight that we rethink this, and we think about consumers and patients as the contributors of data, and that those data are something that we should be leveraging to develop better interventions on the prevention side, but also on the treatment and condition management side, because those same behaviors that are implicated in the onset of all of those chronic conditions are also required for people to be engaging in order to successfully manage and treat those conditions. So you've probably heard the term big data, and you might be asking yourself, what the heck is big data? So I want to first talk through some of the basics of what big data is. And I'm going to talk about this largely from the perspective of technology, because that's my bias, that's the space I work in, but there are obviously lots of other sources where we might see large amounts of data. So the technologies that we have are mobile phones, wearable devices, patient monitoring systems, social media, all of those things allow us to begin to capture detailed, accurate, and longitudinal records of individuals' behaviors and their environment and some of the broader contextual factors. So we've got these rich sources of information, and there's an opportunity for us to harness those.
So if you want to think about the future of medicine and what that entails, think today about the largest car company in the world. Uber doesn't own a single car. Think of the largest hotel chain in the world today. Airbnb doesn't own a single hotel. The biggest medical systems in the future are going to own no hospitals. It's going to be devices that are monitoring the lives of millions of patients simultaneously, that's looking to see, do you have the beginning signs of a cancer emerging, to not treat the cancer, but to prevent the cancer from ever occurring. Like that day is definitely coming. My name is Dr. Eric Schott. I'm director of the Icon Institute at the Mount Sinai Health System in New York. Please call me Eric. I'm not a real doctor. Big data's impact on the practice of medicine is fundamentally going to transform the physician's ability to personalize care directly for you. And the way we're going to get that is you have a handheld device that has amazing capability, think Bluetooth-enabled inhalers for asthma patients, scales, blood pressure monitors, EKG devices. The sequencing of the human genome, that first genome cost us $3 billion to sequence. Today you can do it for $1,000. We're going to have individualized models for each person that maps out their health course trajectory. It will be something that you're engaged in on a daily basis, but not necessarily actively. You're just being triggered if you need to be, because the algorithm says, okay, you're at super high risk in the next year of progressing into type 2 diabetes. So if you can catch that before the catastrophic state, then the person's not having to come into the hospital. So I grew up in rural Michigan. I had parents that were very religious, to the point of diminishing the role education should play. I was a kind of a very curious kid, and the home life got to the point where I felt like escape into the military was my path. Once I started college and started.
As fun as his life story is, we're going to go on and talk a little bit more about big data. So what I like about the first part of that video is I think it does such a nice job of talking about not only the volume and the sources of data, but how that could potentially plug into health and the healthcare system and other information. Did this go off? This seems not to be working again. We'll change. Oh, it doesn't want me to do that either. There we go. Yes, I do have tiger striped shoes. So big data is a seriously large volume of data. Like, it is hard to conceptualize and wrap our heads around the volume of data that we have. But when we talk about big data, it's very easy to kind of get sucked down the rabbit hole of the shiny and, oh my gosh, it's so much data, it's so big. It's not really about the amount of data. It's about what all of that data will allow us to do. All of that data will allow us to gain insights that we can use for improved decision-making in healthcare, but also improved decision-making at the individual level. Thinking about how we use these types of wearable devices and getting a notification that, oh, your heart rate is out of range, might be worth giving your doctor a call or paying attention to that. Those are the types of things that not only allow physicians and folks in the medical community to make decisions, but also allow individuals to take charge of their health in ways that they have not been able to before. Also engaging in more timely prevention and more precise intervention. Just to give you a sense of the scope that we're talking about here, today, every 2 days, we generate as much data as we did from the beginning of time until 2000. And by 2020, the amount of digital information that's available will have grown from 5 zettabytes to 50 zettabytes. So this is something that is increasing exponentially over very short periods of time. 2020 is not that far away. So where do all these data come from? Well, they come from lots of sources, and we've talked about some of the sources that they come from within the healthcare system, but they also come from wearable devices, and I see that many of you here in the audience are wearing such devices. They come from social media. How many of you are on social media at all? You have a Facebook account, you've gone to Snapchat once, you've gone to Twitter, Instagram, you've used Skype, the whole nine. All of those are sources of data and sources of information. Fitness apps and other sorts of health apps. People use these things, even if you use it only for a few days, those are other important sources of data. And finally, the types of devices that you might receive as a recommendation from your physician to help you monitor or care for a chronic condition, everything from digital scales to digital glucometers, pulse ox machines, et cetera. So lots of different places for this data to come from that is generated from us as consumers. And as I said, the importance here isn't around how much data there is, it's really around what can we do with that data. And so one of the things that I'm particularly excited about in the space of thinking about the behavioral phenome is thinking about how might we use this rich real-world data to begin to phenotype individuals into types of users or types of consumers so that we can describe these subgroups of participants and develop much more sophisticated interventions that are better able to reach a broader range of people. So to date, as a behavioral scientist, most of what I'm relying on is data that applies to most of the people most of the time. And one of the great lessons I've learned in working in health technology is that if you design for everyone, you have effectively designed for no one, because none of us is an average human. We are all a mix of characteristics and experiences and backgrounds and social contexts. And so being able to harness these data to be able to use them in a way that develops much better interventions that are going to reach each of you in the ways that you need to be reached is really profound potential. So one way that we can start to think about how we use this data is to kind of follow this digital trail. Passive sensing is really fascinating area of study because it requires very little ask of humans. For those of you who work in research, there are a few things more painful than sending out your survey at the end of a study only to have maybe 75% of people return the responses. Or if you're doing some mid-study check-ins, you don't really know what's going on with folks. But through passive sensing, all you have to do is make sure that a person is charging and wearing their device, so you're able to get the information about how well is your intervention working. Or if you're a patient and you're trying to make a change in your health or your health behavior, these devices have capacity to be able to show your physician patterns of things that might be happening for you with relatively low lift on your part. There are also ways that you can detect information not only from wearable sensors, but also thinking about populations and how do we harness social media data. There's been some really fascinating work around this and looking at things like Twitter conversations that occur following incidences of gun violence, Twitter conversations that occur in the context of when there's a flu epidemic or when there's a measles outbreak, and what's happening in those circles, so that we're understanding not only how do we target things that are happening at an individual level, but how might we develop more effective community level interventions to meet the needs of communities in real time and on demand. Kind of going along with this same trend around social media and voice analysis, this is work from Anne de Smet, who's at Ghent University in Belgium. They've done some work looking at geotagged Twitter data. Again, really fascinating way for us to start to see what conversations are happening about what things in what locations. And that's going to be something that is highly contextualized and very much about where people are geographically. One of the experiences that I've had recently in kind of being bi-coastal, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you might know that there's a little bit of political stuff that goes on there. And when you live in D.C., where I've lived for the last 10 years, like, that's just in the air. Like, people are thinking about it, they're talking about it. True story, my next door neighbor is the Assistant Attorney General to the Office of Legal Counsel for the White House. So there are things happening there. Silicon Valley has a different culture, but it's the same dynamic. It's just different people. Still talking about systems of power, but they're talking about venture capitalists. They're talking about, Mark Zuckerberg. But people have they're having different conversations because there are different things that are going on there. DC, we're not that concerned about earthquakes or wildfires, but certainly a big concern for folks living on the West Coast. And so thinking about how we can leverage social media to better understand what's going on in those conversations. Instagram is another rich data source because there you're not only getting people's words, but you're getting people's pictures. And pictures have the capacity to tell lots of interesting things about what is interesting to people, what's motivating people, but also really interesting work going on right now on how is it that we might be able to use pictures and images of humans to preemptively detect when they might be headed toward, for example, some kind of neurological event or some kind of condition. So again, really rich data sources, really great potential. There are also opportunities through the use of sensors, not only to detect information kind of continuously over time, but also to detect kind of segments or moments of experience. So for example, those of you who are doing research in physical activity, I know you're really interested often in things like heart rate variability and capturing these snippets of when people's heart rates might be really high and then how do they recover. You can use these data to start to see like, oh, here's a person who has an interesting pattern of physical activity. They will go all out really hard once and then do nothing for several days. I wonder why that might be. Well, maybe what's going on is something around heart rate variability and recovery. And through the use of sensors, you might be able to detect that. And then how might you intervene on that? So maybe this is a person who needs some encouragement to dial it down a little bit on one workout so that they're able to do a second workout a day or two later, and they're not kind of flaming out and pushing their system too hard. And so the idea here is that while we're talking about each of these elements of technology individually, the real benefit of leveraging technology comes from how we combine all of these different sources of data to create profiles of consumers, to understand not only their usage patterns, but kind of their behavioral patterns and areas of interest. Also understanding market segments. One of the great criticisms of a lot of these technologies is, it's really just healthy people who are wearing these things. Like, how do we get these to the people who are most in need of them? And what might it take to better understand what would make these technologies useful and relevant to those populations so we're better equipped to reach them at the point of care and ideally before. All these data mean nothing if we don't take the data and use them to create meaningful insights. In some of the very early work in digital technology, the user-facing part of this was eye-bleedingly painful. Like, you would look at a screen that was just a bunch of dots or a ton of information. One of the things that's really important in the responsible development of these technologies is making sure that if you are developing a consumer-facing thing, that the insights you provide are useful to the consumers who are using it. And so that requires thinking about graphical representations and data visualization in a different way. And one of the things that I think is essential here is that we work in a cross-disciplinary way, because I am not a data visualization person. I can do stick figures, but I am not going to be the person who can say, what's the way that a person's going to understand, oh, see this pattern of sleep, you dipped below 6 hours of sleep on this day, and your eating pattern on that same day was a little different than it was on the days that you were sleeping more than that. Oh, and your physical activity was less too. So maybe we've got something going on here with sleep. So how do we take all of those diverse sources of information and turn them into something that becomes highly actionable for a patient, so that they're able to live the life that they want to live. So part of this is about how do we take into account kind of the broader context that people are existing in? How do we interpret the information for them? How do we combine these different data sources? And then on the research and intervention and patient care side of things, how do we use that information to develop these recognizable user profiles? Because there's a funnel here, right? So I talked a little bit ago about how if you design for everyone, you've functionally designed for no one. But the next step to that isn't like, and this is the specific intervention for this person who has all of these qualities. The next step is to say, what are 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 types of people that I might be trying to solve for? So I've worked a lot in the health and wellness space, and so a lot of what we're trying to do is to get people to eat well and be physically active and to sleep consistently. So you can imagine, if you will, a person who is pretty active. Maybe they're a marathoner, and they probably don't need a whole lot of help on the physical activity front, but maybe what they're trying to figure out is, what is the right amount of sleep that I need to do in the 2 days leading up to a long run? And what do I need to be fueling over that time? Maybe what we want, one of the use cases we want to solve for is an endurance athlete. And then on the other side, maybe one of the things we want to solve for is person who was physically active when they were much younger and have not been physically active since, and really not a huge fan of trying new things. That's going to be a very different intervention experience for that person. And so what we want to do is start to use the data to figure out, where are there some clear patterns? Where can we identify, like, oh, there's a clustering of behaviors occurring together that looks like this over here that's slightly different from this cluster here, and how do we use that information to develop interventions that are better targeted to each of those different types of folks? And then, really importantly, one of the things that we need to do for consumers is make sure that we are presenting this information in a way that allows them to understand their own behaviors and patterns, so that they can start to develop some self-insights, because ultimately we don't want to create a situation where people are entirely reliant on technology and constant feedback. We want this to start to become sort of self-perpetuating for them too. And so related to this, kind of the next step in the process is to start to create these user stories or personas. We want to think about ways that a user might be represented so that we can develop strategies that better meet their needs, and that we're, again, pulling from several data sources so that we have rich description. It's not just a person who is a marathoner. They're a marathoner who is a woman in her mid-40s who has taken a break, I'm speaking hypothetically about, but really wants to get back to it and is missing being in shape. And we know this because we have 10 years of her Runkeeper data, and she's wearing a device, and we see that she's only running a couple of days a week. And then there's, like, peaks and valleys in this. Like, we want to use all of those data sources so that we have the richest explanation possible. It is hypothetical. I've heard a story, asking for a friend. And then we pass this information off to our colleagues who are working in development of programs, whether those are app-based programs or maybe it's something in a feedback loop in a digital sensor, to help them with design requirements so that they know who it is that they're designing for. So now I want to move into a bit of a use case as we're thinking about all of these sources of data and how we might leverage these different sources of data. I want to talk a little bit about preventing diabetes. I know some of the folks in the audience work in the space. Maybe some of you have been patients who have been working in the space of diabetes prevention. And we have some common approaches to diabetes prevention. So most notably is the Diabetes Prevention Program. This is a very structured intervention. It includes 16 modules over the course of 6 months, and then there are 10 additional modules up to 1 year. And the goal of the program is to promote modest weight loss of about 5 to 7% of a person's starting weight. And the program emphasizes self-efficacy, so helping people to feel confident that they're able to engage in healthy eating and physical activity behaviors, and so forth. But diabetes is a complex illness, and prediabetes is also a complex illness. It requires not just changing a single behavior, but often changing multiple behaviors. And by the way, you're changing those behaviors in the context of your home life, which means that your family might need to make some changes to their dietary patterns or how they're spending their leisure time. And there's this question mark in the literature around what is the best approach when we're asking people to change multiple behaviors. And we're doing this all the time, right? If you get a diagnosis from your physician that you have cardiovascular disease, or you get a diagnosis that you have prediabetes, you're probably going to be given a prescription for a medication. Taking a medication is a behavior. You're going to be asked to make changes to your diet, increase your physical activity. Maybe you're going to need to monitor your weight in a way that you haven't done so before. And so there's this question of, do we throw everything at everybody all at once? Do we do that sequentially? Do we get people started first with diet because that's most likely to lead to weight loss? Or there's some interesting research coming out of a group at Stanford that suggests that it might be helpful to start with physical activity and getting people into a maintenance mindset, because physical activity doesn't do much to help you lose weight, but it will help you maintain your current weight. So maybe we get people started there. There's a good question there to ask, and seems to lend itself very well to precision behavioral medicine. And then there's, again, this collection of behaviors that we're asking people to change. Increasing fiber in the form of fruit, veggies, whole grains, legumes, decreasing added sugar, decreasing saturated fats, increasing healthy fats, and also engaging in physical activity, both cardio and strength. That's a lot to throw at a person all at once. Typically, when we are treating prediabetes, and because we have a diabetes prevention program that's certified at a national level, which is great for standardization and ensuring that people are receiving quality care, but the challenge is that that approach is very one-size-fits-all. And I think this is a place that's ripe for innovation, because not everybody needs to do all the things, and not everybody is going to be equipped to tackle all the things all at once. We also have challenges with these types of programs. So one of the things we know about behavior change is that the longer you're exposed to an intervention, the more likely you are to be successful in changing that behavior. But with both in-person and digital interventions, we have a lot of patient dropout, like people fatigue on it. It becomes inconvenient. Sometimes people don't see the successes they wanted to have, and so they drop out because they're frustrated and they feel discouraged. So personalization is another way that we could potentially address retention and engagement by mitigating boredom, because behavior change is hard and it becomes onerous. To reduce feelings of overwhelm. So again, when we're asking people to change a lot of behaviors, that can feel like too much. And if we can personalize, maybe we give people, one thing to do at a time, and we allow them to try some things out before adding the next thing. And it also gives us an opportunity to have a better response to failure. I think this is a big gap that we really haven't addressed in the field of behavior change broadly, is behavior change isn't linear. Like, it's not like you create a healthy habit and you're on the straight and narrow for the rest of your life. If you've ever tried to change a behavior, you know full well that that is not at all how that situation works. Instead, it's circuitous, right? Like, you have these times when you're like floating along for days or weeks, months, maybe even years, doing really well. And then you have a setback. Maybe you go on vacation and you kind of don't exercise at all on vacation, or your eating patterns change, your sleep gets off because you're jet lagged. We need to have a better way of catching people when they have those stumbles or those missteps, and personalization is a really cool way to do that. In part because it's rare that people are failing at all of the things all at once. It might be that they just had a little setback in one area, but in their minds, it feels huge. And so how might we design an experience that helps them to remember, like, oh wait, I've actually had some success here before. I know how to do this. That information, those skills, that toolbox hasn't gone away. I just need to have a reminder of how to unearth it, and personalization can help us do this. And then we can think in the digital space about prototyping. Which content is delivered to whom? Not everybody needs to change all behaviors, and not everyone wants to change all behaviors. And I know this is really hard for my clinical colleagues in the room because you want people to do everything. And it is clinically recommended that they do, and I will not argue about that clinical recommendation, but I will say that if you are bludgeoning people with a recommendation to do stuff they don't want to do, you are not going to get very far with them. So let's talk a little bit about some possible user stories. So this is Ellen. She's 54 years old. She loves cooking for her family. She has lots of family food traditions. So Sunday dinners, holiday meals, summer picnics, etc. She's never really been into fitness. She's not a fan of sweating, so exercise is not a few of her favorite things. She's not really sure about technology. And she feels kind of like chronic illness is just part of getting older. Okay, so this is one user type, a person who likes cooking, who has a lot of social value around food, not a fan of exercise, skeptical about tech. Here we have Ted. Ted is 46. He likes to cook, but he doesn't usually have the time. He has a very busy job, and planning meals, going to the grocery store, and then coming home after a long day of work and preparing a meal just isn't in the cards for him most nights. He played sports in high school, but he hasn't really been active in years. He likes to be on his phone to play games at the end of the day because that's his downtime. That's how he unwinds. And for him, health isn't really a top priority. It hasn't been a problem yet. He's fine. And finally, there's Jeanette. Jeanette is 33. She exercises about 5 days a week. She does 3 days of cardio, 2 days of strength, so she is nailing it on the physical activity. She's not a home cook. She eats on the go a lot, partly because of her job, and partly just because she's not really that into cooking. She finds dieting restrictive, and so this idea that I have to be on a diet or that I have to watch what I eat, like, just feels super controlling to her. And most of the women in her family have diabetes, and so her view of diabetes is that this is just kind of like it was a thing she was waiting to have happen. So all three of these people have prediabetes, but they have very different profiles, both psychologically in terms of how they think about these behaviors, and also behaviorally in terms of what are they already doing and what are they relatively more or less open to doing. So now it's time for some audience participation. So just a quick review. This is how we typically treat diabetes prevention. We've got 16 modules. It takes about 6 months, and this is true whether this is a program delivered digitally or done in person. The focus is on weight loss and helping people to feel more confident about being physically active and eating healthy. These are the 16 modules that are in the diabetes prevention program. What you will see is there are modules that are around activity, everything around like how do you get active to tracking your activity. There's stuff on eating well, including how to do it, tracking your behavior, and then they move into, and this is the order in which they appear also in the program, getting more active, how to burn more calories than you take in, and so forth. I'm not going to read all of these for you here, but this is the program, and this is how it is delivered to everyone. Now, type 2 diabetes, yes, correct. Thanks for calling that out. So now let's go back to thinking about our users. Let's think about these characters that we have. Let's think about the behaviors they're already doing. Let's think about the things they might be super into trying out and the things that they might be less interested in. And imagine if you were a person who had just received a diagnosis of prediabetes. You know yourself, you know what you're doing, you know the things that you're into, you know the things that feel good to you and that you're like, okay, I'm not super into that, but I'd be willing to try. And the other thing you're like, absolutely not. What happens for you if you get a program like this, and let's say you're not really that into cooking? How does a module on eating well sit with you? How does the idea of tracking your food sit with you? How does something about shopping and cooking specifically sit with you? It probably feels a little bit tone deaf and maybe a little annoying. So let's come back to our folks here. First, as an audience, let's choose one person that we want to focus on. So who do we want to focus on? And I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Who wants to focus on Ellen? Okay, we've got a handful of hands in the air. Ellen is the woman on the left. Ted is the guy in the middle. Who wants to focus on Ted? And Jeanette's the woman on the right. All right, we seem to have a vote in favor of Jeanette. So we're gonna go with Jeanette. Just as a refresher, Jeanette is 33 years old. She exercises 5 days a week, doing both cardio and strength. She does not like to cook. She's eating out a lot. She hates the idea of dieting, and she has a lot of folks in her family who have diabetes. What would this program look like for Jeanette if this program were really designed for Jeanette? What would you take out? Feel free to shout out some answers. She's already active, so maybe we don't need to give her a bunch of modules on activity because she's already doing that and she knows how to do it. Great. What else? Find time for fitness. Right. She's clearly already finding time for fitness, so that's out. I'm sorry? Keep your heart healthy. Maybe that's less relevant to her because it's about exercise, or maybe that's one that's on the fence because diet is also something that affects health. So maybe we put that one in the on the fence bucket. Shopping and cooking. She's already said explicitly that she is really not into cooking. And so having a whole thing focused on that, maybe we save that till the end if that's a thing she decides she wants to try later. So we take that out. What are some things we might really want to elevate for Jeanette? Eat well away from home. She eats on the go a lot, absolutely. And maybe we want to have more than one module on that for Jeanette. Maybe instead of tracking your food, we want Jeanette specifically to track her eating out. What else might we want to elevate for Jeanette? Staying motivated. Nutrition. Tell me more about, if you were Jeanette, what would you want to see about nutrition?
Well, if she eats out a lot, she should understand what she's eating, which is where it comes back to what's in the food, which goes back to nutrition.
Yeah, so for her, she's eating out a lot, and maybe she's just not aware of what she's eating, or maybe she's not aware of where there might be some healthy choices that she could make when she's eating out. Absolutely. What else might we want to make really special for Jeanette? Taking charge of your thoughts. Say more about this. What do you think? Where do you think Jeanette's hangups might be around her thought patterns?
Well, she feels she's predestined to type 2 diabetes. She already believes that. The idea that food can be both good and healthy. So mindful eating.
Yeah, so in terms of changing your thoughts, and I'm saying this because I know there's some folks out here who might, out in the spillover area, who may not have heard that, changing your thoughts around eating, or changing your thoughts. So some things that Jeanette might need to work on. Maybe she's feeling like she was kind of predestined to get diabetes, and maybe she needs a reminder that there are things she can do to take charge of her health and really feel empowered by that. It may also be the case that she needs to be reminded that this isn't about what you're giving up. Food is good and food can be healthy, and it's not about just giving up or restricting things. And also maybe she needs a little help with mindful eating, paying attention to when and how much she eats.
I was going to ask, what exactly means get support? Because you can get a friend or a family to part of what she's.
Excellent question. And I think, so the question was around getting support. What does it mean to get support? And I think that's a prime area for personalization. And this is one of the things, so I was a relationship scientist before I was a behavior change scientist. And so I think a lot about these things. And I've also worked with folks who are trying to quit smoking and bringing in a support partner in that experience. And let me tell you, some people have amazing support systems and some people have jerks in their lives. And so this idea that social support is great and social support is always good is not true. And so support might look different for different people, and we all experience different things as supportive, right? So, for example, I have a friend who has had a long time struggle with her weight, and she's had periods of time where she's felt really good and also felt like she was eating well and that she was feeling energized. And she and her partner have been together for a very long time, and if he asks her a single question about food, it's Stabbyville, like she is ready to take him out. That's not supportive to her. She does not feel good when he's like, hey, so I noticed you're having a little extra snack food. What's going on? She does not want to have that conversation. That is not supportive, and Andrew had better duck and cover. So I think support is a really great issue. Yeah, in the back. Absolutely. So just to kind of paraphrase real quickly, the idea that people do not come to a behavior change experience in a neat little box. They come with a whole host of lived experiences, including positive and negative experiences with behavior change, positive and negative experiences in their lives broadly. And so maybe they're wrestling with issues around depression and anxiety or perhaps trauma. And there's also a wide range of sophistication in terms of how much people know about each of these areas. Everything from complete novice, I know nothing about how to eat healthy, to I read blogs, to I've worked very closely with a dietitian at one point or another in my life, or I'm into reading the scientific literature on this. So we definitely run the whole gamut, and that's a really important question too. How do we tailor information that generates knowledge in a way that reaches those different levels of sophistication so that people feel like they're being respected for what they know, but they're not being left with knowledge gaps? Yeah. Yeah, so what I think, so just to summarize what she said really quickly for those who may not have heard, this idea of sometimes patients come into these experiences with really lofty goals. So maybe they're somebody who's coming in and saying, I want to lose 50 pounds. And maybe the starting point is 5 to 7% of your starting weight. Or maybe there are kind of some target behavior. So the target behavior that was just identified was kind of the consumption of sugary beverages, and also even diet soft drinks that include artificial sweeteners. And I think the broader thing that I would want to point to in this is two things. One is absolutely people have differences in how they set goals. So some people will come in to a health behavior experience and they will set goals that are a little ridiculous, frankly. It's like, you didn't get to where you are in a week, so why is your expectation that you're going to undo where you are in that amount of time? So how might we design experiences that help people to calibrate their goals? Have your eye on the prize, absolutely. Have that long-term goal, but what's the first step toward that goal? The first step toward losing 50 pounds, maybe it is 5%. Maybe it is that you want to try to lose 5 pounds this month, whatever it is. So kind of helping, designing experiences that help people to set realistic goals while also allowing them to have kind of a broader vision or a longer term strategy. And then the second is this idea of, for some people, it is often helpful to start with a single target behavior that's relatively easy to implement. Other people want to go whole hog, or they want to experiment in kind of two different areas, and developing really sophisticated precision behavioral interventions should allow for both of those pathways. So that we are being responsive to folks who feel easily overwhelmed, as well as responding to the folks who are ready to take it all on. So just to kind of wrap things up here, there are two big questions that remain, at least two, and I'm sure there are others. Many of you may be thinking, well, you're talking about precision behavioral medicine and precision behavior change. What about personality? And I was having this conversation earlier today. Personality is this thing that sounds intuitively appealing, right? Like, we all think about ourselves and our character traits, and this is who I am and how I am, and I want a program to really be like the right match for my personality. And I want to offer a couple of things. So first, there are really good indicators of broad personality traits, most notably what's known as the Big Five. So these are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion versus introversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is generally kind of like not being a great human being or being kind of negative affect. Those indicators, tend to be fairly robust, and we tend to have really good ways of measuring them. And we do know, kind of some general patterns of findings in terms of which types of people are most likely to achieve behavior change. Spoiler is conscientiousness. That being said, the research is less clear on how to use that information to develop targeted precision stuff. We don't know yet from the science, like, how we might use that information about personality to make a match between somebody's experience in digital, like what's the tone and the feel and so forth. And some of the things are frankly a little bit counterintuitive. So one of the things that we know happens is it's actually not extroverts who benefit the most from being connected on social media. It's introverts, because social media allows you to be a lurker. Like, you can be there, you don't have to engage, you don't have to make a bunch of small talk, but you can see what other people are doing, you can benefit from those social learnings and so forth. So I just want to say that, like, that is a space that is intuitively appealing. It's not yet clear what we do with that information. And then there's also, frankly, just a lot of garbage measures of personality that sound really nifty. If it's on BuzzFeed, it's garbage in terms of its reliability, but super interesting if you know what Game of Thrones character you would be. Finally, we haven't talked at all tonight about ethics, and that's a serious and important issue when we're talking about these technologies and how the data are used. As a consumer, and this is me speaking, I feel very firmly that as a consumer, you should have the right to have ownership over your data, to say who has access to your data, and to say who gets to use your data. And you should also have an easy way out if you decide you no longer wish to share those data. And so this was also part of a conversation I was having earlier today with some folks. That's a really important thing. It is not okay to just mine data for the sake of informing the use of these interventions. And so there's a really important opportunity here for both technology companies who are developing these technologies to make their terms of use easy to understand. I'm honestly not sure what's worse, an informed consent document that somebody signs in a research study or terms of use for engaging in anything in technology. They are so full of legal gobbledygook that nobody can possibly understand them, and it's never clear how you opt in or opt out if you decide at the beginning that you do or don't want to be part of that. So I know we've all been hearing a lot in the news about Google and the University of Chicago getting a lot of trouble for sharing patient data that turned out not to be as de-identified as they thought it was. There are potential dangers to some of these data, and it's frankly not that hard to identify an individual person with the level of sophistication of these technologies. Geolocation, the stuff that's on your phone and where you are, we're pretty darn close to laser precision on that. We don't know just what street you might be on or what zip code you might be on. We know what room you might be in the house. That is the level of sophistication here, and we just have to be very thoughtful about who has access to the data, how do consumers control that access to data, and how do we protect the data? So there's huge responsibility there for researchers and also for technology companies to make sure that they're really not just doing the bare minimum, but going above and beyond on making sure that the data are protected. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Dr. Patrick. We're going to have a wonderful chance to have a robust discussion here in about 10 minutes. So I know we've already interacted a good bit, but again, we'll step out for 10 minutes, get you a drink and some food, but we are going to start back in 10 minutes. So if you're out there, we're going to need to start back. So please enjoy. And we'll start again.
We've been, so our paths crossed somewhere in the NIH sphere, and then he emailed us yeah, we should get together. I think it's been a month. We keep traveling. That's okay. I was away, and I'll be in but we have to get. And that's when you met it. So. No, Eric.
So I went into the place, and there was your foundation, and it was very nice, and I was 2 hours after meeting with the same person.
Oh, we have to keep track with us. It's a small world. We have to find ways to work with them.
So
like a phenotype. And the way they built that too jives with our like mindset where our philosophy is like shared nothing infrastructure. Where you say, you can take something from somewhere because everybody wants to give you that embrace where come stay with me and I will like give you everything and then yeah. Yeah, it's truly a democratizing access. So maybe we should just get these two guys to come and visit. I mean, I don't know mine either, but I know of his work. Yeah, it's just a fun activity.
So I wanted to ask a quick question.
How are you, sir? I am doing good, so it's finally we get to have a drink today.
Yeah.
And how long it's taken?
I'm drinking, man.
I read it tonight, and then once you got here, I continued in my matter. We've been trying for the last month. She shows up at my office randomly. I try to go see something, and then they will meet. Like, it's happening.
Good.
Ski and I were trying to like
Yeah, we're gonna make it happen tonight, Niraj.
have a drink together. It's been what, a year
A year.
now?
Yeah, so tonight we're gonna have a drink.
Tonight, like people have been trying to like
Perfect.
Worlds are colliding.
The universe conspires. Okay.
Are we ready? What do you think?
Yeah.
I disagree.
I think we're gonna get started. Why don't we get started? If I could have the panelists come up. Ricky.
No. Yeah, it is awesome and people can talk to them.
Yeah.
Thanks, yes.
So we might need to hand this one around. I think we're going to get started if all the panelists can make their way up here.
I do want to acknowledge BIO5. These wonderful events have all been made possible by BIO5, and we had contributions from Cal. But the BIO5, Jennifer Barton, her staff, give them a big hand because all of this.
Are we ready? All right. Thanks for sticking with us, everybody. And yes, a big thank you to Dr. Jennifer Barton and her amazing staff here at BIO5 for hosting us in this great event. We have a wonderful panel of people, very diverse panel, working along the theme that Ski is talking about here. Lots of different backgrounds. They're all scientists, really great scientists in their own right. So maybe I can just briefly introduce them so you know who's going to kind of respond. And then what we're going to do is start off with maybe a few questions that I think they're really well positioned to answer, but then we really want to have a conversation with you. So we're looking for your questions as well. So tonight, really far on the far side of the table, Nirav Merchant is with us. Thanks, Nirav. And Nirav is the director of the UA Data Science Institute, and very important in gathering all these big data that we heard about tonight and putting it together in a way that makes sense. And he's co-leader of a National Science Foundation-funded project called Cyverse, which if you're here at the University of Arizona, you've most likely heard about. It is a huge, nationally known, maybe even internationally, large-scale cyber infrastructure project for the life sciences. So it is a resource for scientists to use, and Nirav has been instrumental in making that happen. And his background's engineering, systems industrial engineering, and is very interested in scalable computational platforms and open science, and I've benefited from working with him over the years. So thanks for coming tonight. Next to him, Dr. Jennifer Barton, who we already introduced. She's the director of this institute of BIO5, and our host tonight. And Dr. Barton's a professor of engineering as well, biomedical engineering and electrical and computer engineering, and also has expertise in medical imaging and optical sciences and biosystems engineering. She puts all that together to build miniature endoscopes and that combine optical imaging techniques and are really designed to understand biological processes, and cancer detection is something she's been really working on. So how can you use miniaturized, really amazing engineering technologies to identify important health conditions before they become an issue. And then Dr. Ricky Simpson's here with us, my colleague from Nutritional Sciences. He's an exercise physiologist and an immunobiologist. And he came to us recently via Houston, University of Texas, Houston, and before that, Edinburgh, which you'll when he starts talking, you'll understand why I say that. And he's an expert in exercise and stress on the immune system, does work with space flight and with astronauts. So you can ask him about that after our presentation. So all these folks were gathered for a very good reason. They have vastly different views, but all converging in the space of big data and precision health and precision medicine. So with that, thanks for joining us. And I'll kick us off, but if I have questions that sort of relate to each of these panelists' expertise, but again, we really want to hear from you. So what I thought about, thank you for your presentation again, Heather, when I was listening, is there's definitely some kind of low-hanging fruit out there with regard to behavioral phenotyping, right? And I'm wondering maybe if you can comment a little bit more on that. And I'm also interested in sort of the BIO5 perspective, so I want Jennifer to respond to that too. But I don't know if you want to take that. What is a low-hanging fruit? Because I feel like we can do things now. And I feel really jazzed up after kind of hearing you talk, so.
Yeah, so I think some of the low-hanging fruit is really around looking at where we've already got existing data that has come in from interventions and just doing a better job of looking for variability. And part of this is about partnering with data science colleagues who have access to better statistical modeling than what we typically use in public health and behavior change spheres, which are really about averages and helping us to do a better job of teasing apart where are we seeing some differences and where do we have kind of clusters of humans, and whether those clusters are about things like behaviors early on in an intervention. There's been some really interesting work on this in the weight loss world, that people who are more engaged and who lose weight early on in a weight loss intervention, that puts them on a trajectory to lose more weight over time. And so thinking about those types of things, and maybe it's about kind of user engagement patterns. I think that's another really interesting thing that we could start to look at in the space around health apps, because I think that we will probably see that there are just some interesting differences there, right? There are the consistent users, and then there may be sort of like the dabblers who might do a couple days here and a couple days there. And then there are people who are like gung-ho for a time, then they completely ghost and go away. I think we have an opportunity to really understand those kinds of differences and how we might optimize those experiences so that if you're going to be a dabbler, that those 2 or 3 times a week that you're in this experience are exactly what you need them to be. Or if you're going to go gung-ho for a month, let's make sure you get exactly what you need that month. If you're going to be here for the long haul, like, we can dribble stuff out to you at a different pace.
And if I don't know, Dr. Barton, if you want to add to that, just because I think that you have a very global view here at the Institute.
Well, I would have to say that this is what BIO5 does. We bring people together from different disciplines, bring people together from the community, from government, from inside the academy, and put them together. And it's amazing how much expertise is out there and how much we can synergize if we just simply get together. Just today, one of our strategic initiatives that the university is moving forward is using sensors in order to understand human behavior, to understand the environment, and then actually analyze that data in real time and feed it back into interventions that you can do to the people or interventions you can do to the environment. And so we have somebody from our our iSchool, our information school, who has newly come to the university, interested in putting in a holodeck. Yeah, an immersive experience where people can go in and interact with their environment. And then we had other people there, I think some of them are here tonight, who are interested in looking at sleep studies, people who are interested in looking at sweat biomarkers, people who are interested in looking at how your bubble of CO2 when you spend too much time in front of a screen starts affecting your cognition. No, it's just not looking at too much computer. You're actually generating CO2. And this is the first time these people had gotten together, and they just found like 3 or 4 different ways that they're like, oh, you know, I know exactly what to do. I know how to solve that. So I would say our low-hanging fruit here really is for us to have more experiences like this where we need to get together and we can find solutions that other people have already solved and apply them to our own problems.
Thank you. I'm so excited about a holodeck at University of Arizona. The work about the ethics discussion you were kind of getting into, Heather, it made me think about our own work and how we're balancing the need for privacy and at the same time making data democratic, the access to data democratic. So maybe this is a question for Nirav, I think, but how are we balancing this here at the university? It's super important. With big data come big responsibility, right?
I think the answer should be at multiple levels, depending on what kind of data and what permissions you have. But I've seen the university go both ways, where they just become clamped down, and I think that's also a bad thing, and we have to sort of earn the trust of the people that give data to us, and the data stewardship that goes with it is something that we haven't factored into our curriculum, especially as we sort of are in the quote-unquote big data age. So understanding how each of us can be good data stewards so that whoever gives us data is confident that we won't do bad things with it. And if anything bad happened, there is a recourse of moving something back. Because right now, very often when things go bad, you have no control, and that is perpetual. So going back to sort of your question, I think the university has provided a lot of new safeguards, and as Jennifer mentioned, some of the new initiatives, we are going to create a controlled research environment for analysis, where data coming from sensors that are producing things, which I was telling Heather, that every month I'm reading a paper which tells you how to take data that is anonymous and figure out who it is in less than like 4 steps, which is scary, and it's a monthly event. So you know that your data is eventually not going to be anonymous. So if you've signed off something and said, yes, I want to give my data to science, I want to take that responsibility and say, I will protect it in perpetuity so that you are not worried that you gave it to us. So the university, I think, is doing a good job. What we need to be worried about is industry. It's approaching to a point where, trust me, I'm awesome, I'm a good company, that day is over. Those of us remember a company which said, do no evil, removed it from their own tagline, and that's Google, and we know what happens. And so I don't think as users we have to put blind trust in any organization, including universities or companies, but more so companies, because the black box approach, trust my new machine learning method, it has been tested, but it has been tested only on these kinds of population, and I will do A and B test on anybody I feel like, is a bad thing, but that's happening. So as providers of data, as us, we are sensors ourselves. We have to sort of ask more from the organizations and the companies. So I give you a pretty long answer to your short question.
Yeah, and maybe, so I really appreciate that answer, and it's complicated, and we haven't heard from Ricky yet, so I'm gonna ask him. I always appreciate, Ricky, your kind of perspective on stuff when I throw things at you. So what do you think are places or areas in which this work could really go off course? I mean, you've heard kind of the talk tonight and where the big data fit. Where in your perspective could this go terribly wrong? Hopefully not, but.
Yeah, I think it's, because a lot of times when we've been looking at certain interventions, it can be delivered. There is this idea that there is a one-size-fits-all. These are, I look at physical activity, for example, and the American College of Sports Medicine have physical activity guidelines, and this is what everyone should be doing and adhering to. But yeah, that might not work for everyone, but we can still make that person improve their health by intervening by changing their physical activity. So it may be that they don't have to follow these guidelines, but we have to find something that's very tailored to them, so that they can increase their activity and improve their health because of that. So so understanding what all these idiosyncrasies are and how they relate to an individual, I think is beneficial for people who maybe are new to this field and they've been trained the classical way of, this is what we do. It works for most people, therefore that's what we should continue to do with everyone.
Could you speak slower and louder?
I'm sorry, I'm drinking. I'm also Scottish and I'm drinking wine. I'm the only panel member. I'm the only panel member with an alcoholic beverage. I should say that, but yeah, certainly I'll do my best.
So I'd love, unless the panel has a little bit more to add on to that, I'd love to open it up and hear what other people have to say. So I'm going to start on the far side and I'll come back. Because if we have to talk in the mic, or folks at home won't hear you.
First of all, thank you for all being here. I'm Brad Dreyfus from Emergency Medicine and also the College of Public Health. And getting to the question of ethics, what are your thoughts as a panel as far as ethics of diversity? Ensuring we have diversity in those who are developing and thinking about on the academic side, asking these questions and addressing it, but also within the population of folks providing data, and how do we maximize that?
Yeah, I think that's hugely important, and particularly when we think about how we're using big data, thinking about machine learning and those sorts of things. Like the reality is that we're only going to get algorithms out that are as high quality as the data that we put in, and ensuring certainly access to technology and access to this stuff so that diverse voices and diverse experiences are feeding into those algorithms is really critical. But I also think one of the other areas, and this is something that in Silicon Valley there's been a struggle with long term, this is not new, is that there's frankly not a whole lot of diversity in who is building these algorithms. And that, the folks who are building those algorithms tend to be primarily men, primarily white men. Although there is, increasing diversity, but still tends to be largely male, who are developing these algorithms. And how does that influence the way that we see data signals? Because as I mentioned very early on in this, that interpreting the data is really important. And all humans, even scientific humans, have biases, and we bring those to the table. So I think your point is really well made, that we need to be sure that there are diverse data feeds coming into these systems, but also the ways that we're building algorithms and creating insights also take into account and are informed by a diverse set of voices.
Right, and there was the question over here.
Thank you, Carl Krupp from Health Promotion Sciences. First, I want to express my concern that I'll be categorized as a phenotype with negative affect. So please don't do that. The
Give you
second,
a measure for that.
Yeah. The second thing, though, I get concerned when I see this. It's kind of the Oppenheimer problem. Okay, in this brave new world we're creating, what responsibility do we have that all of this, in terms of methods that we as academics are creating, are going to be used just to sell more stuff to people? Because that's what I feel here, that when I see this brave new world where we're collecting all this data about everybody, that in fact, I know what it's going to come down to. I'm going to look I'm going to look on my computer and the perfect ad is going to come up every morning. And they're going to try to sell some stuff to me. And the big concern I have in healthcare, I think, is that we're already selling 200 billion or so unneeded medical services to people. Okay, what responsibility do we have to make sure that the services we're selling are actually evidence-based? I mean, I know how it works because I came out of a corporate background. What's going to happen is we'll develop these wonderful algorithms. They'll be sold to a company. They'll develop these wonderful packages, and none of us in public health will be able to afford them, okay? Only companies that sell people stuff will be able to afford them, and they'll just sell more stuff to people. I mean, that's my concern. So I'd love to hear from you about how we prevent this from becoming something that, you know, that is bad from something that could clearly be good?
I will not try to sell you anything. Just kidding. I think this is something that's been going on for a very long time. We're just sort of waking up today because we're more aware of things. In the 1990s, this is pre-internet days, and go look up something called captology, computers as persuasive technology. They were trying to figure out, even in the Microsoft DOS days, how to sell you something. It's just that the technology was lame and it didn't really click as well. But the efforts, as us as humans trying to do this, it's always been there. So putting that aside, how do we prevent that from happening? And much like any free market, we have to rely on another technology to help us with a technology that we feel is doing bad things to us. So I would say when you start thinking of assistants that you have now, whether it's the Google Assistant or Alexa or whoever that is, the future would be that there is a assistant that you can hire that you can trust or align with, and it's their job to filter out what. Yes, so you have the anti-assistant, and so at some point we have sold our soul to technology. Unless we go live on a mountain without, off the grid type thing, it's not going to be easy. So we have to draw the line, and I think it comes down to ownership of our data. And we have to make whoever is providing us a service, and GDPR is a start. Those of you are aware of what's happening in Europe, where you have the right to forget, you have the right to ask a company to take certain things away, and those companies are abiding by it. US is still sort of slowly waking up to it, and I hope we wake up sooner. But so those are the kind of arrangements where your data now belongs to you because you've already paid for it in some way. Some way, I don't mean just cash or dollars. You have the right to demand what can be done or cannot be done with it, and the companies are to be held accountable. And the moment we become owners of our data, there'll be much more smoother sort of transition between technologies and who you can and cannot trust. But end of the day, people will be selling you stuff that's never going to end. So I've come to terms with that part.
Yeah, I want to add, I was just at the National Cancer Institute last week, and there was an early detection research network there. So what they're really looking at is how can we detect cancers years before you have them. And we're getting better and better at doing that. And that gets to a whole new problem that all of us have tumors. In fact, all of us probably in our lifetime will have cancer. Most of us, fortunately, will have cancer when we die of something else. So you really didn't want to treat that cancer. You didn't want to put that person through that biopsy. You didn't want to put them through the surgery because that was not, that's over-treatment. That's treating something that didn't need to be treated. And I think for the first time, the medical establishment and the researchers are waking up to this potential problem where we have to be very careful. It's not even the false positives we get because we can design our algorithms. These are true positives. These are actual problems that we have, but we have to now go to a next level of sophistication that we're just now figuring out as to which one of these problems is really worth going and fixing. So we're just going to have to stay tuned for that one. That's kind of a little bit different angle to it. And there will be people who will try to sell you. Remember whole body CTs? So that was kind of a disaster because it found a lot of things that weren't important. But we have to establish that as well.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, one for Heather and one for Nirav. My one for Heather is very selfish. We're about to start a hot yoga study to try to understand the adaptive stress response and the molecular underpinnings of that. What I would love to know is how validated are these instruments? Again, it's not going to be my primary endpoint, but clearly it's going to be a secondary endpoint. And I would love to know what this adaptive stress response not only does to heart rate, respiration, pulse ox, sleeping patterns. So how validated is this Garmin device that I have on my arm?
So I cannot speak to the particulars of a particular piece of hardware. But one thing I will say is that the technology with wearable devices and sensors is becoming increasingly sophisticated. It is light years ahead of where it was even 2 or 3 years ago. That being said, the sphere of consumer wearable sensors has not put itself in the space of being considered or classified as medical devices. That's on purpose for lots of reasons, because if you've ever gone through the delightful experience of getting an FDA 510K clearance, it is quite the experience to behold. That being said, I think one of the things we bump into in the research community is assuming that if something hasn't been studied, that means it doesn't work, and that is not true. If it hasn't been studied, it means it has not been studied. That is what we can conclude from that information. And so that being said, pulse ox we're a little farther off on that technology. We are pretty good with much of the technology on heart rate and galvanic skin response types of things. The technology is getting, in general, more sophisticated around not only heart rate variability, but heart rate recovery. So it's getting better. Do you want to hang your hat on that as your primary outcome yet? Probably not. But yeah, like the technology is good. The technology is there. And I think it's also about, like, depending on the research question, like what degree of precision do you absolutely have to have? And when these devices are they off kind of consistently in the same way, in a way that you can predict? And honestly, the reason that work has not been done is because these were developed as consumer devices and not medical devices.
And I guess my question on Nirav is, first of all, I'm dumb as a shoe in data science, so this is a naive question. But in working with metabolomics, as we have for the last few years, and understanding kind of the R suites and things that we can pick out the most discerning things that are responsible for distinguishing one kind of metabotype from another, what models exist in what, in clustering human beings based on personalities? Are there any models out there that really can distinguish the way we can in metabolomics to determine a molecular network? Instead of a molecular network, can we determine a personality network?
So that's definitely a loaded question. I am absolutely dumb as any shoe, even a chappal, in this topic, but I can give you my 2 cents about it, where if you start looking at how companies like Facebook or others quantify you in a graph, in your relationships with anything, whether it's people or your walking pattern or where you hang out. And so the dimensionality of these things is tremendous. And if you start looking at a model that sort of describes something, you have to take a step back, and much like, what is it that you're trying to achieve? And then that's the model that you go after. So if I want to sell you something, the model of what I want to do is optimize on making revenue and pushing a product that's paying me more money and make you buy it. And so that model of the people that would be my potential customers operates so differently than health intervention, where I want you to do something that is possibly a different part of your brain that's getting engaged, and how I would get you down that journey. So short answer would be, there is no singular model, and these are dynamic situations, much like the field that you live in, where what works today for this person by tomorrow would need a little bit more different tact to get them to where you're trying to go. So that dynamic nature. So I feel there isn't an easy straightforward model, but it is a collection and ensemble of models that work closely, and then as long as you factored in the diversity, you can then come to some reasonable statistical approximation of what that would be. But as I said, I'm the shoe that you talked of, so that's the best I can do.
I'm sure there's other questions. Hi.
Hi, I'm Jose Ek. I do physiology. My question is going to touch upon yours and a little bit of ethics. I'm being optimistic. I'm thinking that this is going to work and somebody is going to start changing their behavior and start eating well and leaving alcohol, everything. But I think of some people that will wake up and will not leave alcohol and will not leave tobacco and will keep eating sweets. Because there are big companies behind these products with big ads convincing you that you need them. So how is this big data collection is going to, if any way exists, to affect a change on policy so that these big companies understand the damage that they are causing? Do you think that is possible?
Well, I know from, not being a big data expert, but policies have changed to prevent tobacco advertising. I remember in the UK, so in the United Kingdom, we obviously have a national health service, and people's health can therefore put a burden on society and taxes and so forth. So I remember in the 1990s, there was just a complete ban on the advertising of tobacco. And initially it started around high schools. You weren't allowed to advertise. First of all, you couldn't advertise tobacco on the television. You could only advertise it on billboards. And then those billboards had to be within they couldn't be within a certain radius of a high school. And then eventually they just completely eradicated it. So I think when you have for-profit organizations and then you have, social healthcare, which is a system I'm used to from being in the UK, then it could be very different in terms of how these policies are established. But may have more insight than that I do.
Yeah, it's tricky, and it's tricky in the U.S. because of the way our legal system, where economic system works. It's been a really tough fight on tobacco. It's one that's ongoing just with new technologies now. So yeah, and the reality is those companies are all using big data to target marketing. And so I think where I see the greatest opportunity here is it is past time for public health researchers and for data scientists and for companies who claim to be doing good to step up and start to fight fire with fire. And that is where this comes in from where I sit.
All right, and I see John Paul raising a hand. There's one question here too, so.
Hi, Purnima Madhivanan, College of Public Health. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and this opportunity to ask this question. Again, I don't want to be the damper here, but when I think about all the cases that you presented in your talk with the 3 cases, when I think back at the work that we were doing in San Francisco in the Bay Area, the idea that somebody could just choose one of these 3 prototypes and say, okay, what do we have to change in these modules? If a woman has to cross a street where there is a gun violence happening to go buy her vegetables, what kind of an intervention are we going to plan for her in terms of changing the modules, right? And then if somebody does have access to healthy food, but then they don't have a green space to go and walk around, what would you talk about in terms of those modules? Do those modules really work for the populations that we are talking about? And where were these modules developed? With what populations? The culture and the people, the populations here are changing so rapidly. So what we're talking about, even in terms of precision medicine and precision public health, if we look back now and go at a macro view, the only interventions that have worked, which we talked about with tobacco, was advocacy. When UCSF put all of the papers online for everybody to see, and there was so much pushback that we were able to get policy change done. So what is our responsibility as public health people, as scientists, as university people doing this research to make sure that we can have systems change happen, systemic changes happen. We can't just depend and blame people and tell them they have to change their behavior. We have to have advocacy at a political level as well. So where would that discussion start?
I could speak to that for a minute maybe, and this is something that I had a dinner last night with the CEO of the food bank, Michael McDonald, and this was exactly the question that he raised about working with university though. So how do nonprofits work with university to benefit from everything that we do here, and how do we partner in a respectful way? And the answer is this is a very complex, and he said systems change, so I'm really glad you brought that up. It's a very complex issue. And we need to tackle it as a team, as partners. So I think being a really engaged partner is one way. So you speak to the social determinants of health. That is a huge challenge for so many people. And all the facets you mentioned, food security makes it impossible, food insecurity, for people to manage diabetes, gun violence, right? Right. So, yeah, please.
So I see patients in all strata across the socioeconomic strata. I see VIPs. And I see patients who are homeless. Anybody can put down their big gulp, and anybody can go walk Tumamook Hill, and they can walk the foothills safely. I have patients who live in South Tucson losing 30 pounds because they stopped drinking soda, and they do it safely. So it's possible. It isn't about rich versus poor. It really isn't. I see patients at South Campus, and I see patients at North Campus, and they can do it. They really can. They just need somebody who can advocate for them. And I do. And I pep talk them at every visit, and I say, you can do this. And I hold their hand along the way. So it's possible.
I know John Paul had a question. We have a comment here. Are you going to comment on sort of the conversation? Different question. Okay, I'm going to go to John Paul because he's very patient.
Thank you. So one of the benefits of using these large-scale data sets is that you can detect small to moderate effects. You can characterize components of variants that may have prognostic significance. So when we talk about the behavioral phenome, one of my questions is, so how quantitative can this be? As a psychologist, you understand these models of state versus trait and what modifiable factors may be more likely to affect change or the decision to change behavior. So my question is, can you make any reasonable prediction? Is there useful prognostic significance to these models? So, you're defining individual differences, essentially, right? So you have a type, but maybe, people can become, clustered into groups. There are ways that you can identify states and traits that may affect behavior. How quantitative is that? Again, what is the prognostic value of some of these models? How close are we? And if you do plan an intervention and someone has a cluster of constructs that may define them, are there ways to actually pick out the ones that would be most effective in optimizing the process? Because we're talking about, again, dynamic systems here, okay? The process of implementing an intervention. Is it quantitative? Are there ways that you can pick out the key elements? And secondly, can you quantify the prognostic significance of maybe implementing a certain approach?
So it's late in the day, and I hope that I have heard the nuances of your question correctly, and please correct me if I've not. The answer is that these are honestly very early days in behavioral phenotyping, and so a lot of it is hugely exploratory. And I think, yes, it is quantitative. Yes, I think we will become more sophisticated about identifying where is there clear signal and not just so much data that we're just getting a ton of information and it's hard to parse out. I think those are things that we will become more sophisticated about. But in the interim, I think there's a really important opportunity for us to think about and form informed hypotheses, and looking at the existing literature. Where have we gotten biggest bang for buck? Policy is a great place to start and to think about that. But also to continue to think about where are, we have, and this was a conversation I had with the grad students earlier today. They were like, so what are your measures of success? How do you know that the thing that you're developing in technology is working? And the answer is that changes over time. When we are early in the game and developing a brand new thing, we're looking at, do people use it? The end. That is, we aren't going to behavior change and health outcomes out of the gates. And I think that's a really important distinction, because when you're working, and I've been an academic researcher, and so I feel that pain and I understand, you want to get to statistical significance and are we making a difference in people's health? And we ultimately want to get there with the technology. But the first is, are people going to use it? And if they use it, who is using it? Are we getting all of the people who are dealing with all of the problems? Are we getting most of them? And if they're not all using it, who's not using it and why? And so we're bringing together really sophisticated quantitative and qualitative approaches where we're trying to understand users from the beginning, instead of throwing a fully baked thing out at people and saying, here's the thing, it's done, I hope it works. There's much more iterative approach that we're using in the private sector in developing these technologies. And so the first question we're asking is, do people use it? If so, who uses it and for how long? And then the next question is, and how do we improve upon that? Well, let's pull in some science on that. We know that people need to build some skills individually. Maybe they have some systemic barriers that they need to overcome. Maybe it's not on them to overcome those barriers. Maybe it's about helping people to find ways to work around those things, lots of different ways to do that. So the answer is, it's messy. We are very early in the game. Yes, there are quantitative pieces to this, but that's not the question we're trying to answer right now.
Time for one more question.
Okay, so this is a short question, close-ended. So if you could create an algorithm or device that could accurately phenotype people using all of the variables you described, and a company wants to buy your device or algorithm, how much would you ask that company?
How much money?
Yeah. Let's say you spent 10 years creating a device or an algorithm, and let's say you spent, I don't know, $5 million in research and development. How much would you sell your product for?
I think starting 4 companies and taking one public, the answer is, what will the market pay for it?
A lot of money.
I'm proud to be at an institution who would have a conversation like we've had tonight, a discussion. I think Dr. Patrick, I think all the panel, I thank you all for coming. I thank you for staying till 8 o'clock in the evening and
7 o'clock.
Oh.
It's only 7.
7 o'clock in the evening. I'm taking away my wine now. But thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. I did want to mention we have 3 more speakers in this series. The next one is Charles Raison, and Charles is an expert on hyperthermia, hot yoga, the adaptive stress response, and how that impacts depression and mental health. So fascinating speaker, and he'll be speaking the day before my birthday, so you can bring presents, October 30th. And then Joel Dudley, who is Mr. Precision Health at Mount Sinai, will be here November 12th, and then a very good friend of mine at Johns Hopkins, Raska Matthias, will be talking about leveraging big data to assess healthy aging, and that'll be on November 21st. So everyone keep coming, and these are wonderful discussions, and thank you all, thank you everybody.
Nice job, Melanie.
I'm on the list for going to dinner tonight, but I'm actually not going to be able to make it. But I'm sure Melanie will take you somewhere really nice. But it's really nice meeting you. Chatting to you. All right, take care.
But I think the awesome news is that when we all just kind of agreed, we're not going to have a Holodex space and a closed system space. We're going to take the whole space. So we're going to have a big area that's reconfigurable and that you can project things on the wall, and we're going to have a small
Music to my ears because I was worried we're just not going to it. I mean, I was staying on the outside waiting to like come in when things got too bad, but it was like this.
I had
Whatever you
before
did.
they were done, but they were like actively moving walls and talking about sprinklers and stuff by the time I left. So
That's music. That's music to my ears. Hey, Brad. Good to see you, man.
Thank you both for putting these together. I feel like these are some of the best discussions coming out of the
we had a little descent going on here. That was good.
How are things going? And I'll try to see maybe Monday. I think it looks like you have some time Monday.
All right. Hey, thank you again. Yeah. I think it went really well. I was just saying that I think we're not going to try to carve out separate spaces for the holodeck and for, we want some small rooms where we can test, an office cubicle type thing. So I think we're going to, and basically because the space is already that way, where there's big areas and then there's offices already, we're mostly, trying to keep renovation costs down. I think we're mostly going to keep it the way it is. Just clean it up a little bit, and all agree to share space. That should be nice, and yeah, then Ski can have a place to do his hot yoga, which requires us,
We're gonna like heat up the room, right?
Yeah, we haven't gotten into that one yet. I did warn them about, if we want to pump up the CO2 level or we want to make the temperature in here. Yeah, they're not going to change the building system, so we have to bring.
Oh, we just have to get one of those things that leak, like they have the steam pipes going.
Yeah. Low budget.
Yeah, it's like it's warmy also.